Hey guys, tonight we're talking about medieval products. Things that were invented with confidence, failed immediately, annoyed everyone involved, and somehow survived long enough for us to still be using them. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Medieval toothpaste was not designed to care for teeth. It was designed to intimidate them. The idea was noble. Clean your mouth, avoid rot, appear vaguely civilized. The execution, however, suggested medieval people were conducting a long-term experiment to see how much pain a human could tolerate before simply giving up on smiling. The ingredients alone read like a medieval prank. Crushed animal bones, burnt shells, wood ash, salt, charcoal, occasionally powdered brick, because when your dental plan is already unhinged, why not commit fully? These substances were mixed into gritty powders or pastes and rubbed directly onto teeth using fingers, cloth, or what can only be described as medieval optimism. This did technically remove plaque. It also removed enamel, dignity, and any joy associated with having a mouth. Brushing was not refreshing. It was an event. People did not freshen up. They braced themselves. The sensation has been described by historians as unpleasant, abrasive, and deeply regrettable, like chewing sand while someone whispers encouragement. And medieval people noticed. They were not fools. They noticed their teeth becoming sensitive. They noticed bleeding. They noticed that drinking anything remotely warm or cold now felt like a personal attack. Many responded logically by stopping entirely. Others continued brushing out of fear that not brushing would somehow be worse, which is a very medieval approach to problem solving. Here is the real failure. Toothpaste did not significantly improve dental outcomes. Teeth still rotted. Gums still receded. Infections still happened. The product hurt, delivered minimal results, and inspired zero enthusiasm. In modern terms, it would have been discontinued after a week and recalled for emotional damage. And yet, humanity refused to let it die. Instead of abandoning toothpaste, we refined it. We softened the abrasives. We added mint so it felt like progress. We gave it reassuring names like gentle, advanced, and recommended by dentists, even though the basic principle remains unchanged. Scrape your teeth daily and hope science has improved things enough to make it survivable. Even today, toothpaste still works by abrasion. It just smiles politely while doing it. So when you brush your teeth and wince at that one sensitive spot, remember, this is not a flaw. This is tradition. You are participating in a medieval product that failed immediately, annoyed everyone involved, and somehow became mandatory. History did not fix toothpaste. It just made it taste like mint and lie about it. Medieval soap was not created to pamper the skin. It was created to win a fight against dirt. And if your skin happened to lose that fight, that was considered acceptable collateral damage. Soap in the Middle Ages was typically made from animal fat mixed with lye, a substance so aggressive it can dissolve organic matter, including the illusion that bathing should feel pleasant. This mixture technically cleaned the body, in the same way that sanding a table technically cleans it. Yes, the surface becomes free of grime, but also free of its original texture, finish, and happiness. Using medieval soap was an experience. It burned. It dried the skin to the point where cracking was not a risk, but an expectation. Hair washed with it often became brittle, straw-like, or simply left the building altogether. Baldness was not uncommon, and no one was sure whether to blame age, stress, or the soap actively trying to erase them. And yet, people kept using it. Why? Because the alternative was smelling like medieval life, which included livestock, smoke, sweat, and existential dread. Soap may have hurt, but it hurt less than social exile. Cleanliness was not about comfort, it was about survival and reputation. If you smelled too bad, people assumed you were sick, cursed, or morally questionable. Here is where soap truly failed. It was inconsistent. Some batches cleaned reasonably well. Others caused rashes, chemical burns, or skin reactions that would have made modern dermatologists faint. There was no quality control, no testing, no warning labels, just a merchant saying, "Trust me," which in medieval times meant absolutely nothing. And yet, once again, humanity refused to let the idea die. Instead of admitting that soap was unpleasant and poorly designed, people refined it. They adjusted the fat. They softened the lye. They added herbs. Eventually, centuries later, soap became something you might actually enjoy using, but the core idea remained untouched. Rub fat on your body, hope it removes dirt, and accept mild suffering as part of the process. Even today, soap still dries skin. It still irritates. It still requires moisturizing products to undo what it just did. We have simply normalized this cycle and added pleasant scents to distract ourselves. So the next time your hands feel dry after washing them, remember, this is not a flaw. This is legacy. You are using a medieval product that failed its original users, annoyed them deeply, and somehow survived unchanged in spirit. Soap did not get better. We just got used to it. Early eyeglasses were not designed with comfort, convenience, or human anatomy in mind. They were designed with one simple goal: make letters slightly less blurry, and let the wearer figure out the rest. Everything beyond that was apparently considered optional. The first medieval spectacles appeared around the late Middle Ages, and they failed almost immediately in every category except one. They technically worked. These early glasses were heavy, awkward, and balanced directly on the nose with the confidence of an object that wanted to fall off. There were no arms to hook over the ears, no adjustable parts, just two lenses connected by hope and friction. If you moved your head too quickly, the glasses slid off. If you bent over, they fell. If you sneezed, they abandoned you. Reading while wearing medieval eyeglasses required monk-like discipline. You had to sit perfectly upright, hold your book at the correct angle, and resist the urge to exist too energetically. Any sudden movement could send your lenses tumbling into the dirt, where they would be immediately stepped on by someone who did not care about your vision journey. And let us be clear, people hated them. Eyeglasses were uncomfortable, socially awkward, and openly mocked. Some believed they were unnatural, others claimed they weakened the eyes. A few suspected they were borderline witchcraft. Nothing says cutting-edge technology like being accused of sorcery because you want to read without squinting. They also barely worked. Early lenses corrected only one specific problem, usually farsightedness, and did so imperfectly. If your vision issue was slightly different, congratulations. These glasses were decorative. You could see a little better, but not enough to justify the inconvenience, judgment, and constant fear of dropping them. And yet, humanity refused to abandon the idea. Instead of admitting eyeglasses were a failure, people doubled down. They added frames. They added arms. They refined lenses. They kept the same basic concept and dragged it forward through centuries of discomfort. Even now, glasses slip, pinch, fog up, scratch, and break at the worst possible moment. We complain constantly. We still wear them. Eyeglasses are the perfect medieval failure product. People disliked them from the beginning. They were uncomfortable, unreliable, and socially risky. But they solved just enough of a problem that no one could justify throwing them away. So when your glasses slide down your nose or fog up the moment you step outside, remember, this is not bad design. This is tradition. Medieval alarm clocks were invented for people who hated sleeping too long, but were apparently fine with mild terror. These devices were not designed to wake you gently. They were designed to interrupt your existence with just enough chaos to force consciousness. Early alarm mechanisms came in many deeply questionable forms. Some used weights that slowly descended overnight until they triggered a bell. Others involved candles marked with nails or metal balls that, once the wax burned down, would drop onto a plate with a dramatic clatter. The idea was simple. Noise equals waking. Precision was optional. Safety was negotiable. Accuracy was optimistic. Medieval alarm clocks did not care what time it actually was. They cared only that something happened eventually. If you needed to wake before dawn, you might wake before midnight, or not at all, or during a small house fire. It was a flexible system, and people hated them. Imagine trusting your entire workday, prayer schedule, or survival routine to a candle slowly burning in a drafty room. If the flame flickered wrong, congratulations. You are now late. If the wax burned too fast, you woke up early and stared into the darkness, questioning every life choice that led you here. Some alarms were so loud and violent that they startled entire households awake, including people who had absolutely nothing scheduled that morning. Medieval mornings were not private affairs. One person's alarm was everyone's problem. And yet, despite the inconvenience, danger, and sheer unreliability, the concept refused to die. Instead of saying, perhaps humans were not meant to be shocked awake by collapsing objects, people doubled down. They refined the idea. They added gears, springs, bells, eventually electricity. Now we use phones that scream at us every morning like emotionally distant medieval bells with Wi-Fi, and we still hate them. No one enjoys alarm clocks. We dread them. We negotiate with them. We hit snooze like it is a legally binding contract. Entire industries exist to make alarms gentler, softer, or more natural, which is humanity quietly admitting that the original idea was a mistake. But the core concept remains unchanged. Artificial noise forces wakefulness. Wakefulness leads to productivity. Productivity justifies suffering. Medieval alarm clocks failed at comfort, accuracy, and user satisfaction. They succeeded only in one thing: making sure people woke up against their will. That single success was apparently enough to carry the product through centuries. So tomorrow morning, when your alarm goes off and you feel instant resentment, remember, this is not modern inconvenience. This is medieval heritage ringing in your ears. Medieval candles were not romantic. They were not cozy. They were not atmospheric. They were barely functional sticks of disappointment that happened to be on fire. Most medieval candles were made from animal tallow, rendered fat taken from cows or sheep. This meant they smelled faintly of livestock, smoked aggressively, and dripped molten grease everywhere like they were actively trying to ruin your furniture. Beeswax candles existed, but those were expensive and mostly reserved for churches, nobles, or people who wanted to flex their wealth through illumination. Lighting a candle did not create a soft glow. It created a small, flickering argument between flame, smoke, and gravity. Tallow candles burned unevenly, bent under their own heat, and showered hot wax onto tables, floors, hands, and occasionally faces. People did not relax by candlelight. They monitored it nervously. The light itself was underwhelming. One candle barely illuminated a room. 2 candles meant luxury. 3 candles meant you were either wealthy or doing something suspicious. Reading by candlelight was difficult, eye-straining, and often accompanied by coughing as smoke gathered near the ceiling like an unwanted houseguest. And yet, candles were everywhere. Why? Because there was no alternative. Oil lamps required oil. Torches were dangerous indoors. Candles, as awful as they were portable, controllable, and only mildly catastrophic. So people tolerated them, complained constantly, and kept using them. Candles failed at efficiency. They failed at cleanliness. They failed at comfort. They failed at safety. Medieval records mention fires caused by candles with alarming frequency, usually followed by phrases like tragic accident and everything burned down. And still, humanity refused to let them go. Instead of abandoning candles, we refined them. We improved wicks. We cleaned wax. We reduced smoke. And then, centuries later, something strange happened. We started buying them voluntarily. We labelled them relaxing. We scented them. We lit them during baths and called it self-care, completely forgetting that medieval people would have associated candlelight with sore eyes and the constant fear of house fires. Candles are the perfect medieval failure product. They never worked particularly well. They annoyed everyone. They were dangerous, messy, and inefficient. But they survived. So the next time you light a candle and sigh contentedly, remember, you are enjoying a product that once smelled like a barn, burned down houses, and existed purely because people had no better option. History did not improve candles. It just convinced us to like them. Medieval mattresses were not designed for rest. They were designed for lying down, which medieval people apparently considered good enough. Comfort was not a design goal. Comfort was a rumour. Most medieval mattresses were large fabric sacks stuffed with straw, hay, dried leaves, or whatever plant matter had not already been eaten by livestock. If you were wealthy, you upgraded to feathers, which sounds luxurious until you realise those feathers flattened within days and stabbed you repeatedly through thin cloth like tiny, judgmental needles. Sleeping on a medieval mattress was less restful slumber and more negotiation with gravity. The stuffing shifted constantly. You lay down comfortable, woke up partially on the floor, and spent the night adjusting like a rotisserie chicken that had regrets. Straw was especially unforgiving. Broken stalks poked through fabric, scratched skin, and occasionally drew blood. Insects loved it. Rodents moved in. Mold settled quietly. If your mattress started smelling strange, congratulations. Something had probably moved in permanently. And medieval people knew this. They complained endlessly. Writings from the period describe beds as uncomfortable, itchy, and unreliable. Mattresses flattened quickly and required constant refilling, which meant dragging in fresh straw and repeating the process like a seasonal curse. Here is where the product truly failed. Mattresses did not improve sleep quality. People woke up sore, stiff, and tired. Back pain was common. Good rest remained elusive. In modern terms, medieval mattresses had terrible customer satisfaction and zero quality control. And yet, humanity refused to abandon the idea. Instead of questioning whether sleeping on sacks of plant matter was wise, people doubled down. They improved the fabric. They experimented with stuffing. They layered mattresses. Eventually, centuries later, we arrived at foam, springs, and memory materials that still somehow fail to satisfy everyone. We still complain about mattresses. Too soft, too firm, too hot, too expensive. Somehow, after 800 years, we are still arguing about how to sleep comfortably. The medieval mattress failed immediately. It was uncomfortable, unhygienic, and exhausting. But the core idea, stuffing something soft into a sack and lying on it, was never questioned. So when you wake up sore and blame your mattress, remember, this is not modern inconvenience. This is medieval design philosophy, alive and well in your bedroom. Medieval pillows were not designed for comfort. They were designed to exist near your head and occasionally remind you that comfort was not a medieval priority. The idea of a soft, supportive cushion cradling your neck would have sounded suspiciously luxurious, possibly sinful, and almost certainly unnecessary. Early pillows were often stuffed with straw, rags, or rough feathers, and sewn into stiff fabric sacks that flattened almost immediately. Some were so firm they bordered on architectural features. Others were lumpy enough to qualify as terrain. Either way, waking up refreshed was not part of the experience. And if you were poor, you might not have had a pillow at all. You used folded clothing, a wooden block, or your arm. If you were wealthy, congratulations. You had a pillow that still hurt, just with better stitching. Comfort did not scale with income. It merely changed textures. In some regions, pillows were intentionally hard. The logic was that softness encouraged laziness, vanity, or spinal misalignment, depending on who you asked. There was also a belief that soft pillows caused moral weakness, which is a bold claim for an object that barely supported your head in the first place. Pillows also failed hygienically. They absorbed sweat, oils, drool, and whatever insects decided to move in. Washing them was rare. Drying them properly was even rarer. Over time, pillows developed personalities, none of them pleasant. If your pillow smelled odd, That was normal. Everything smelled odd. Despite all this, medieval people kept pillows. Not because they worked well, but because the idea of something under the head was hard to abandon. The product failed at softness, failed at cleanliness, and failed at durability, but it survived as a concept. Fast forward to today, and we are still arguing about pillows. Memory foam versus down, firm versus soft, cooling versus supportive. Entire industries exist to fix a problem medieval people accepted without complaint, waking up uncomfortable and pretending it was fine. Even now, pillows flatten, overheat, trap moisture, and need constant replacement. We complain, but we do not stop using them. We simply buy more, hoping the next one will finally solve what the last 10 could not. Pillows are a medieval failure that became tradition. They never worked perfectly. They annoyed everyone, and somehow they are still essential. So when you flip your pillow to the cool side tonight and feel brief relief, remember, you are participating in centuries of disappointment, just better marketed. Buttons were not invented to make life easier. They were invented to make clothing more annoying while pretending to be sophisticated. Before buttons, medieval people used ties, pins, and laces. Simple systems that worked quickly and allowed you to escape your clothes without a prolonged struggle. Buttons changed all of that. Early buttons appeared in the Middle Ages as decorative status symbols, not functional fasteners. They were small, fiddly, and proudly inefficient. Instead of securing garments quickly, they demanded time, precision, and patience. 3 things medieval life was already running dangerously low on. Buttoning a tunic could take several minutes. Undoing it took even longer. Cold fingers made the process feel like a test of personal worth. Drop a button, and it vanished into the straw-covered floor forever, joining a lost civilization of other tiny objects sacrificed to inconvenience. And yet, buttons spread. Why? Because they looked refined. Buttons suggested wealth, tailoring, and leisure. The kind of leisure required to stand still while someone else fastened you into your outfit like a human parcel. The more buttons you had, the more it signaled that you were important enough to waste time. Functionally, buttons failed. They popped off. They broke. They loosened. They offered no flexibility if your weight changed, which medieval diets were famously unpredictable about. Laces adjusted, pins adapted, buttons judged silently. Buttons also made laundry worse. Washing garments with buttons risked damage, tangling, or breakage. Repairing them required skill, thread, and eyesight. All things medieval peasants did not have in abundance. Despite this, humanity doubled down. Instead of admitting that buttons were inferior to faster systems, we embraced them. We added more buttons, smaller buttons, decorative buttons that did absolutely nothing. Even today, clothing includes buttons that exist purely to look busy while contributing nothing to function. We still struggle with them. We still lose them. We still get annoyed when one pops off in public. Buttons are the perfect medieval failure product. Slow, unnecessary, fragile, and irritating, yet socially powerful enough to survive unchanged in principle for centuries. So the next time you button a shirt and feel that tiny flicker of frustration, remember, this is not poor modern design. This is medieval fashion, winning an argument it never deserved to win. Medieval public toilets were not designed for hygiene. They were designed for containment, and even that goal was approached with alarming optimism. The basic idea was simple. Designate a hole, convince people to aim for it, and trust gravity to solve the rest. Science was not invited to this meeting. Most medieval public toilets were long wooden benches, with multiple holes cut into them, positioned over pits, rivers, or flowing water if someone was feeling ambitious. There were no dividers, no privacy, no personal space. Using the toilet was a communal activity, whether you wanted it to be or not. Conversation happened, eye contact happened, regret happened. Cleanliness was theoretical. These toilets were rarely cleaned, frequently overflowing, and always aromatic. The smell was not unpleasant. It was structural. It clung to buildings. It drifted through streets. It announced itself long before you arrived, giving you time to reconsider your life choices. Disease spread easily, but medieval people did not connect toilets with illness in any meaningful way. If you got sick, that was God, fate, or bad air. Not the whole everyone was using repeatedly all day. The concept failed spectacularly at sanitation, health, and dignity. And yet, the idea survived. Instead of abandoning shared toilet spaces, humanity kept them. We refined the pits, added water, added pipes, added flushing, added signs asking people to wash their hands, because apparently that still needed clarification centuries later. Modern public bathrooms are objectively better, and yet they still inspire discomfort, anxiety, and avoidance. We still hesitate before entering. We still judge cleanliness instantly. We still avoid touching surfaces whenever possible. The medieval experience lives on emotionally, if not structurally. Public toilets have never been loved. They have always been tolerated. They fail at comfort. They fail at privacy. They fail at peace of mind. And yet they are unavoidable, because the alternative is far worse. Medieval public toilets were a failure because they solved one problem while creating several new ones. They removed waste from sight, but not from life. They gathered people together at their most vulnerable moment and called it infrastructure. So the next time you enter a public restroom and feel a wave of hesitation, remember, this discomfort is not modern, it is inherited. You are participating in a medieval solution that barely worked then and only slightly works now. History did not fix public toilets. It just added doors and hoped you would not think too hard about it. Medieval umbrellas were not designed to protect you from the weather. They were designed to make a philosophical statement. Specifically, I am trying something and I regret it already. Early umbrellas were heavy, awkward, and deeply offended by wind. They were often made with wooden frames, stiff fabric, and absolutely no understanding of aerodynamics. Opening one in a breeze was less an act of protection and more an invitation to wrestle with nature in public. They barely worked. Rain still found its way in from the sides. Wind flipped them inside out long before that was a recognised engineering flaw. And when they broke, which they did enthusiastically, they broke spectacularly, snapping ribs and collapsing like disappointed spiders. Socially, umbrellas were a disaster. Carrying one marked you as strange, pretentious, or suspiciously foreign. Many people believed umbrellas were unmanly, impractical, or an insult to God's weather decisions. If it was raining, you were expected to accept it. Shielding yourself was viewed as soft behaviour. Despite this, umbrellas persisted. Why? Because on a calm day, in a gentle drizzle, standing perfectly still, they sort of worked. And humanity has always been willing to tolerate 90% failure if something works 10% of the time and looks vaguely sophisticated while doing it. Umbrellas also failed at portability. They were large, rigid, and inconvenient to carry when not in use, which was most of the time. People dragged them around like uncomfortable walking sticks, bumping into others and apologising constantly. And yet, instead of abandoning the idea, we refined it. We added collapsible frames. We lightened materials. We improved fabric. We pretended this solved the core issue, even though modern umbrellas still invert, break, and abandon you the moment weather becomes emotionally intense. We still lose them. We still forget them. We still buy cheap ones knowing they will die within weeks. Umbrellas are a medieval failure product that survived on pure optimism. They never fully solved the problem they were designed for. They simply offered the illusion of control over rain, an illusion humans find deeply comforting. So the next time your umbrella turns inside out in public while you quietly fight it back into shape, remember, this is not poor modern engineering. This is medieval stubbornness unfolding above your head. Medieval locks were not designed to stop criminals. They were designed to make honest people feel optimistic. The basic idea was comforting. Place a piece of metal between your belongings and the rest of the world, and sleep better at night. The reality, unfortunately, was far less reassuring. Early medieval locks were bulky, inconsistent, and surprisingly easy to defeat if you had time, patience, or a vaguely shaped piece of metal. Keys were large, awkward, and looked like something you would use to summon a ghost. Losing one was a disaster, replacing one was worse, and trusting one required faith bordering on delusion. Locks failed constantly. They jammed. They rusted. They broke in cold weather. Some opened if you shook them aggressively, which meant even thieves with no skill could succeed through enthusiasm alone. Others worked only if you held the key at exactly the right angle while whispering encouragement. Security was mostly symbolic. A locked chest did not say, "This is impossible to steal." It said, "Please steal something else first." And medieval thieves understood this perfectly. Many did not bother picking locks. They simply broke the container, because the lock itself was often stronger in concept than in construction. And yet, people loved locks. Why? Because they offered psychological comfort. Even a bad lock feels better than no lock. It tells you that you tried, that you cared, that you participated in the illusion of control over your possessions. Instead of abandoning locks when they clearly failed, medieval people kept improving them. They added complexity, wards, tumblers, traps. Each new version promised security and delivered mild inconvenience, and we kept the idea alive. Even today, locks fail. Keys snap, doors jam, passwords get forgotten, security systems get bypassed. We still rely on tiny mechanisms to protect everything we own, and we still feel betrayed when they fail us. Locks are a perfect medieval failure product. They never fully stopped theft. They complicated access. They required constant maintenance. And they survived because humans crave the comfort of believing their stuff is safe. So the next time you lock a door and still feel the urge to double-check it, remember, this anxiety is not modern. It is medieval reassurance doing its very best. Medieval makeup was not designed to enhance beauty. It was designed to win a staring contest with death and convince society you were healthy enough to survive the week. Pale skin was fashionable because it suggested you did not work outside, did not sweat, and were not currently being crushed by peasant labour. The solution was simple. Paint your face white and hope no one asked too many questions. The most popular ingredient was lead. Yes, actual lead. Ground into powders and applied generously to the face, it created the desired ghostly pallor while slowly poisoning the wearer. Skin damage, hair loss, tooth decay, and neurological problems followed. Medieval people noticed the side effects. They just decided beauty was worth it. Rouge was no better. Made from crushed insects, toxic minerals, or plants that absolutely should not have been rubbed on skin, it irritated faces and caused rashes. Lips cracked, cheeks burned. But the colour looked fashionable for a few hours, and that was apparently enough. Makeup failed completely at safety. It failed at skincare. It failed at long-term health. In modern terms, this product would have been recalled immediately and banned by every regulatory body on Earth. And yet, humanity refused to stop. Instead of abandoning makeup when it actively harmed users, people refined it. They removed the worst poisons. They replaced them with slightly less poisonous substances. Eventually, we reached a point where makeup mostly does not kill you, which is a low but impressive bar. Even now, makeup still irritates skin. It clogs pores, it causes breakouts, it requires entire removal routines to undo the damage it just did. We apply products in the morning and spend the evening repairing the consequences, just like medieval users did, only now with better lighting and more mirrors. Makeup is a medieval failure product because everyone knew it was bad. They saw the damage, they experienced the pain, they complained, and they kept using it anyway because social pressure mattered more than comfort or health. So the next time your skin reacts badly to a cosmetic product and you sigh in resignation, remember, this is not modern inconvenience. This is medieval beauty standards refusing to die. Medieval medical bandages were not designed to heal wounds. They were designed to make everyone feel like something was being done, which in medieval medicine counted as success. The basic idea was simple. If something is bleeding, wrap it. With what? Whatever cloth was nearby. Old linen, rags, torn clothing. Sometimes bandages were reused because laundry was difficult and optimism was strong. Cleanliness was not a requirement. Faith was. These bandages trapped dirt, moisture and bacteria with impressive efficiency. Instead of protecting wounds, they created warm, enclosed environments where infections could thrive happily. If a wound became red, swollen, or started smelling strange, that was considered a normal stage of healing, or a sign that God was deeply involved. Medieval people noticed that wounds often worsened after being bandaged. They noticed fever, pain, and spreading infection. They noticed limbs turning colours that limbs should not turn. And yet the practice continued. Why? Because doing nothing felt worse. Bandaging gave structure to care. It gave patients hope. It gave healers the appearance of competence. Removing a bandage felt irresponsible, even if keeping it on was slowly destroying the patient. And here is where the product truly failed. Bandages were often paired with substances that made things worse. Honey, herbs, wine, animal fat, sometimes helpful, sometimes disastrous. There was no way to tell. Medical outcomes were treated like surprise endings. In modern terms, medieval bandages had catastrophic side effects and wildly inconsistent results. They failed at sanitation. They failed at healing. They failed at preventing infection. But they succeeded at one crucial thing: ritual. Instead of abandoning bandages, humanity refined them. We cleaned the cloth, sterilized it, improved materials. But the core medieval idea remains untouched. Wrap the wound and trust the process. Even now, bandages trap moisture. They irritate skin. They occasionally cause infection if left too long. We still argue about whether to let a wound breathe or keep it covered, a debate medieval people were unknowingly having without the vocabulary. So the next time you peel off a bandage and wince at what you see underneath, remember, this discomfort is not modern. It is medieval medicine, doing its best and failing forward. Medieval footwear was not designed for comfort. It was designed to technically exist between your foot and the ground, and even that goal was approached with cautious optimism. Shoes were stiff, thin, and unforgiving. Walking all day meant pain was not a possibility. It was a feature. To solve this, medieval people invented insoles. And by invented, I mean they stuffed things into their shoes and hoped for mercy. Straw, cloth scraps, moss, hay, whatever was nearby and vaguely soft was pushed inside. This padding shifted constantly, bunched up, flattened within hours, and smelled like it had its own opinions. At first it felt better, briefly. Then the stuffing migrated. One step later, all the cushioning was under your toes. 2 steps later, it vanished entirely. By midday, you were walking on bare leather again, except now your shoe also contained damp organic matter, slowly becoming a science experiment. Insoles failed at durability. They failed at stability. They failed at hygiene. Wet straw inside a shoe did not dry quickly. It rotted. It attracted insects. If you removed it at the end of the day, you were greeted by a smell that suggested your foot had lived a full, independent life. And medieval people knew this. They complained. They replaced stuffing constantly. They accepted that walking hurt and that foot comfort was a modern fantasy. Yet instead of abandoning insoles, they kept them, because even temporary relief was better than none. This is where the failure becomes impressive. Instead of questioning whether stuffing plants into shoes was a flawed concept, humanity refined it. We replaced straw with felt, felt with cork, cork with foam, foam with gel, and somehow, after centuries of innovation, people still complain about insoles not working properly. Too soft, too firm, too thin, too bulky. Sound familiar? Modern insoles still flatten. They still shift. They still smell. We still remove them occasionally and question our life choices. The materials changed, but the experience did not. Footwear insoles are a medieval failure product that survived through pure desperation. They never fully solved the problem they were created for. They simply made walking slightly less miserable for a short period of time, which, in medieval logic, counted as success. So the next time your feet ache and you consider buying new insoles, remember, this disappointment is ancient. You are walking in medieval footsteps, literally and emotionally. Medieval paperwork was not designed to make life easier. It was designed to exist, multiply, and slowly drain the will of everyone involved. The moment medieval societies discovered paper records, they immediately asked the most dangerous question in human history. What if we wrote this down? Again. Charters, permits, tax records, guild memberships, land deeds, church documents. Everything required paper. And not just one copy, multiple copies, stored in different places, written by hand, slowly, painfully, often incorrectly. The process failed at efficiency immediately. Copying documents took hours, days, sometimes weeks. Mistakes were common, corrections were messy. Entire disputes erupted over spelling errors or smudged ink. If a document was lost, burned, stolen, or eaten by rodents, congratulations. History had just reset your legal existence. And medieval people hated it. Records from the period are filled with complaints about clerks, delays, confusing language, and endless repetition. People travelled long distances only to be told they were missing a document they had never been informed existed. Sound familiar? Good. That means the system is working exactly as intended. Paper bureaucracy failed because it created more problems than it solved. It slowed decisions. It centralised power. It favoured those who could read, write, and afford scribes. For everyone else, paperwork was a maze designed to exhaust you into compliance. And yet, humanity clung to it like a bad habit. Instead of simplifying systems, medieval societies expanded them. More forms, more seals, more signatures, more layers of approval. Every problem became a paperwork problem, and paperwork became the problem itself. Fast forward to today, and nothing has changed except the medium. We still fill out forms. We still repeat information. We still submit documents only to be told they are missing one tiny detail. Paper became digital, but the frustration stayed beautifully intact. We still joke about bureaucracy. We still suffer through it. We still accept it as unavoidable. Paper bureaucracy is the ultimate medieval failure product because it never worked smoothly, never pleased users, and never delivered clarity. Yet it survived because institutions loved it. It created order for those in charge and confusion for everyone else. So the next time you fill out a form that asks for the same information 3 times and then rejects it anyway, remember, this is not modern inefficiency. This is medieval administration, alive, well, and still wasting your time. Mary Shelley was born into a household where ideas mattered more than comfort, reputation, or safety. From the moment she entered the world in 1797, her life was shaped by intellect, controversy, and loss. She was the daughter of 2 of the most radical thinkers in Britain, people whose names were spoken with admiration in some circles and suspicion in others. Her father, William Godwin, believed society could be rebuilt through reason, education, and moral improvement. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, had written one of the most daring books of the age, arguing that women were not naturally inferior, merely denied education and independence. Mary never knew her mother. Wollstonecraft died just 10 days after giving birth, leaving behind a newborn daughter and a legacy that would loom over Mary's entire life. From childhood onward, Mary grew up haunted by an absence she could never fill. She would later visit her mother's grave to read, write, and think, treating it as both shrine and classroom. Death was not an abstract concept in her early life. It was personal, immediate, and formative. Her father raised her surrounded by books, debates, and visiting intellectuals. The house was often filled with writers, philosophers, and political radicals, all arguing about revolution, justice, and the future of humanity. This was not a gentle or sheltered upbringing. Godwin believed children should be shaped by reason rather than discipline, but his ideals did not always translate into warmth. Mary was intellectually stimulated, but emotionally lonely, especially after her father remarried. Her stepmother favoured her own children, and Mary often felt like an outsider in her own home. Still, books became her refuge. She absorbed history, poetry, philosophy, and science at an early age, developing an imagination fueled by both knowledge and isolation. She learned early that ideas had consequences, that bold thinking could bring admiration, but also condemnation. This lesson would follow her throughout her life. From the very beginning, Mary Shelley stood at the intersection of creation and loss, brilliance and sorrow. She was born into a world of revolutionary thought, but also into a silence left by death. That tension, between intellectual ambition and emotional pain, would one day give birth to one of the most enduring stories ever written. By the time Mary Shelley reached her mid-teens, she was already restless. The world inside her father's house felt cramped, not physically but emotionally. Ideas flowed freely, but affection did not. It was during this vulnerable period that she met a man who seemed to embody everything she longed for: passion, rebellion, and poetic fire. His name was Percy Bysshe Shelley. Percy was already married when they met, which in early 19th century England was not a minor inconvenience, but a social landmine. He was known as a radical poet, an atheist, and a political troublemaker, exactly the sort of person respectable society warned young women to avoid. Naturally, Mary fell in love with him almost immediately. He treated her as an intellectual equal, encouraged her writing, and spoke of freedom with the intensity of someone determined to live by his ideals, no matter the cost. Their relationship quickly became a scandal. Mary's father, despite his radical philosophy, was horrified. He had written about free love in theory, but watching his teenage daughter run off with a married man was another matter entirely. Yet Mary was undeterred. In 1814, she and Percy fled England together, accompanied by Mary's stepsister, Claire Clairmont. It was less a romantic honeymoon, and more a chaotic act of rebellion. Their journey through France, Switzerland, and Germany was difficult, uncomfortable, and often miserable. They travelled on foot, slept poorly, ran out of money, and faced constant uncertainty. But for Mary, this escape was intoxicating. She had chosen love and freedom over obedience, fully aware that society would never forgive her for it. At just 16, she had severed her place in polite society with remarkable resolve. The emotional toll was heavy. Letters from home went unanswered. Friends turned cold. Respectable doors closed permanently. Yet Mary learned something crucial during this period. Independence came at a steep price, but submission cost even more. She was no longer simply the daughter of famous thinkers. She was now the author of her own scandal. This period of exile hardened her. Love, she discovered, was not a fairy tale, but a force capable of destruction as well as inspiration. These lessons, about devotion, defiance, and consequence, would soon shape the darkest and most powerful ideas she ever put to paper. In 1816, Mary Shelley arrived in Switzerland expecting inspiration and beauty. What she encountered instead was darkness, literal and psychological. That year would later be remembered as the Year Without a Summer, caused by a massive volcanic eruption that filled the atmosphere with ash and blotted out the sun. Cold rain fell relentlessly. Skies stayed grey. Days felt unfinished. For Mary, the gloom seeped into everything. She and Percy Bysshe Shelley settled near Lake Geneva, not far from the rented villa of Lord Byron, already infamous for his excesses and genius. The group that gathered there, poets, lovers, and restless minds, spent their days trapped indoors, reading German ghost stories aloud by candlelight, arguing about science, life, and the soul. Conversations drifted toward electricity, galvanism, and the disturbing question of whether life itself could be artificially created. It was Byron who proposed a challenge. Each person should write a ghost story. At first, Mary struggled. Nights passed with no ideas, only unease. She felt like an observer rather than a creator, surrounded by towering male intellects. But her imagination was quietly assembling something far more powerful than a simple ghost tale. One night, unable to sleep, Mary experienced what she later described as a waking dream. She saw a pale student kneeling beside a thing he had assembled, watching it stir to life. The horror was not just in the creature, but in its maker, terrified by his own success. The image struck her with sudden clarity and became impossible to ignore. This was not a story about monsters in the traditional sense. It was about creation without responsibility, ambition without foresight, and the loneliness of being cast into the world unwanted. Mary drew unconsciously from everything she knew: her mother's death after childbirth, her father's cold idealism, her own experiences of abandonment and loss. Out of that sleepless night emerged the seed of Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. It was not born from comfort or joy, but from isolation, fear, and deep reflection on what it means to bring life into the world. That dark summer marked a turning point. Mary was no longer merely absorbing ideas. She was transforming them. In a world without sunlight, she imagined a spark powerful enough to animate the dead, and in doing so, quietly changed literature forever. The creation of Frankenstein did not bring immediate triumph to Mary Shelley. Instead, the years that followed were marked by a far more intimate and devastating education, motherhood, and the repeated experience of loss. While still in her late teens, Mary became pregnant for the first time. The child was born prematurely and lived only a few days. Mary recorded the event in her journal with quiet restraint, but the pain beneath her words was unmistakable. She dreamed of the baby coming back to life, warmed by the fire. It was a haunting image, and one that echoed eerily with the themes already forming in her imagination. More pregnancies followed, and with them more tragedy. Of Mary's children, only one would survive into adulthood. Each loss deepened her understanding of grief, responsibility, and the cruel randomness of existence. These were not abstract ideas to her. They were lived realities. While Percy Shelley pursued poetry and ideals with relentless energy, Mary was often left to bear the physical and emotional consequences of their shared life. The contrast between creation and destruction became inescapable. To give life was to risk unbearable pain. To love deeply was to invite devastation. These experiences sharpened the emotional core of Frankenstein, transforming it from a clever philosophical experiment into something far more human. The creature's abandonment, its longing for connection, and its rage at being rejected all carried the weight of Mary's personal losses. During this period, Mary also faced social isolation. She was judged harshly for her unconventional life, blamed for moral transgressions others freely committed. Respectable society saw her as reckless, improper, even dangerous. Yet she continued to write, revise, and think, often doing so while exhausted, grieving, and financially uncertain. In 1818, Frankenstein was finally published, anonymously. Many readers assumed the author was a man. Some critics praised the novel's originality while condemning its disturbing ideas. Others were unsettled by the fact that such a dark and philosophical work could have come from someone so young. Mary watched quietly as her creation entered the world, much like the creature in her novel, misunderstood, debated, and judged without mercy. Motherhood and grief had carved something permanent into Mary Shelley. They stripped away youthful illusions and replaced them with a deeper, darker clarity. Life, she learned, was fragile, creation was dangerous, and love carried consequences no one could fully control. As Frankenstein began to circulate and stir conversation, Mary Shelley found that recognition did not translate into security. The novel attracted attention, controversy, and curiosity, but very little money. Most of the profits went to publishers, while Mary and her husband continued to live under constant financial strain. Fame, it turned out, was not a reliable source of food, warmth, or stability. In 1816, after years of scandal and uncertainty, Mary finally married Percy Bysshe Shelley. The marriage was made possible by tragedy. Percy's first wife had drowned herself, a death that cast a long shadow over their union. Though the marriage brought a degree of social legitimacy, it did little to ease their deeper problems. Percy remained brilliant, idealistic, and increasingly impractical. Money slipped through his hands almost as quickly as it arrived. He gave generously to friends, causes, and strangers, while Mary worried quietly about debts, children, and survival. Their relationship grew strained. Percy's emotional intensity could be exhausting, and his belief in free love often left Mary feeling insecure and sidelined. She admired his genius, but she also carried the burden of reality, arranging moves, managing finances, and enduring the consequences of his recklessness. While he wrote poetry aimed at eternity, Mary was forced to think about tomorrow. Despite this, she did not stop writing. She revised Frankenstein, contributed essays and reviews, and began work on new fiction. Yet her literary identity remained overshadowed by her husband's reputation. She was often introduced not as an author in her own right, but as Percy Shelley's wife, a label that quietly minimized her achievements. Poverty followed them wherever they went. They moved frequently, fleeing creditors and searching for cheaper living conditions. This instability deepened Mary's sense of displacement. Home was never permanent, and safety always felt provisional. Still, these years refined her voice. She became sharper, more disciplined, and more aware of the cost of idealism when divorced from responsibility. This period forced Mary Shelley to confront a harsh truth. Imagination alone could not sustain a life. Creation required endurance. Genius demanded sacrifice. And love, no matter how passionate, could erode under the weight of hunger, grief, and unmet expectations. The tension between vision and survival would remain a central theme in both her life and her work. By the early 1820s, Mary Shelley and Percy Bysshe Shelley left England for Italy, hoping distance might solve what proximity had failed to fix. Italy promised beauty, warmth, and a lower cost of living. It also offered escape from creditors, judgment, and the ghosts of their earlier choices. For a time, the move felt almost successful. The landscapes were luminous, the cities ancient and alive, and the intellectual circles stimulating. Yet beneath the surface, the same fractures remained. Italy became a place of contrasts. There were moments of genuine happiness, long walks, shared reading, conversations about art and history. But these were punctured repeatedly by tragedy. 2 of Mary's children died there, taken by illness in quick succession. The losses hollowed her. Grief became routine, something endured rather than processed. Percy, overwhelmed and guilt-ridden, retreated further into idealism, poetry, and emotional distance. Their marriage began to feel less like a partnership and more like coexistence. Percy's belief in emotional freedom led him into intense attachments with other women, arrangements he justified philosophically, but which wounded Mary deeply. She was expected to be understanding, enlightened, modern, yet she remained human. Love, she learned again, could be rationalized into cruelty. Mary continued writing, though often in emotional isolation. She worked on novels such as Valperga, drawing on Italian history and political struggle, but the public reception was lukewarm. Critics compared her unfavorably to her husband, dismissing her work as secondary, derivative, or overly intellectual for a woman. The irony was sharp. She was criticized both for thinking too much and for not being brilliant enough. Italy, once imagined as renewal, slowly became associated with loss. The sunlit landscapes could not soften the accumulating grief. Each death, each disappointment, stripped away another layer of youthful optimism. Mary matured rapidly, not through choice but necessity. Still, something crucial was forming. These years sharpened her understanding of endurance. She saw how ideals collapsed under pressure, how beauty could coexist with suffering, and how individuals survived not through grand philosophies, but through quiet persistence. Italy did not save Mary Shelley, but it forged her. Out of heat, grief, and disillusionment, she emerged with a clearer sense of herself, not as someone orbiting genius, but as a writer shaped by experience, restraint, and a deep knowledge of human fragility. In 1822, everything collapsed. Mary Shelley was only 24 when her life was violently split in two. Her husband, Percy Bysshe Shelley, set sail along the Italian coast in a small boat, confident as ever in his belief that nature could be mastered with courage and intellect. A sudden storm rose without warning. The boat vanished. Days later, Percy's body washed ashore, unrecognizable, battered by the sea. Mary was not present when it happened. She learned of his death through others, forced to imagine the final moments rather than witness them. The shock was absolute. Percy had been many things: brilliant, careless, exhausting, inspiring. But he had been the axis around which her adult life revolved. His death left not only grief, but silence. No more arguments, no more reconciliations, no possibility of change. The aftermath was grim. Percy's body was cremated on the beach in a strange, improvised ceremony attended by friends. Mary did not watch. She could not. Later, she kept his heart, literally, preserved among his papers, a detail often sensationalized but deeply revealing. For Mary, memory was physical. Loss was something you carried, not something you moved past. Now, a widow with a surviving son, she faced an unforgiving reality. There was no romantic tragedy here, only responsibility. She returned to England poorer, more isolated, and socially vulnerable. As Percy's widow, she was both pitied and judged. His family controlled his estate and limited her financial support, forcing her into careful negotiation simply to survive. Yet something shifted. For the first time, Mary was no longer living inside someone else's orbit. The chaos that had defined her youth, scandal, flight, emotional turbulence, was over. What remained was grief, but also clarity. She had endured what few could survive without breaking. Writing became not just expression, but necessity. She edited and published Percy's poems, determined to secure his legacy, even as she quietly constructed her own. She began to understand survival as an act of strength rather than compromise. Percy Shelley's death ended one chapter of Mary's life with brutal finality. But it also forced her into independence. She had outlived her genius husband, outlived her illusions, and outlived the reckless freedom of youth. What came next would be quieter, but no less remarkable. After returning to England, Mary Shelley entered the longest and least romantic phase of her life. There were no dramatic escapes now, no thunderstorm revelations, no reckless geniuses to orbit. Instead, there was work. She was a single mother, a professional writer, and the guardian of a powerful literary legacy, roles that demanded discipline rather than inspiration. Mary supported herself largely through writing, something still rare and precarious for a woman in the early 19th century. She produced novels, biographies, essays, travel writing, and short stories, contributing regularly to magazines and annuals. Works such as The Last Man explored themes of isolation, plague, and the collapse of civilization. Subjects critics found unsettling and oddly unmarketable. Many failed to recognize how deeply personal these stories were. Mary was writing about survival in a world emptied of familiar faces. At the same time, she became the primary editor of Percy Bysshe Shelley's work. She organized his manuscripts, corrected errors, and fought quietly against efforts to soften or censor his more radical ideas. Without her, much of Percy's poetry would likely have been lost or misrepresented. Yet this labour was often invisible. Praise went to the dead poet, not the living woman who preserved him. Mary also faced ongoing financial insecurity and chronic illness. Headaches, weakness, and periods of near paralysis plagued her later years. Still, she continued to write, driven less by ambition than by necessity. She was no longer chasing recognition. She was maintaining independence. What made this period remarkable was not its drama, but its resistance. Mary refused to retreat into obscurity or dependence. She did not remarry, despite opportunities that might have eased her financial burdens. Instead, she chose autonomy in a society that discouraged it. Quietly, persistently, she lived the principles her parents had once written about. Though critics often dismissed her later work, Mary Shelley remained intellectually engaged and politically aware. She followed revolutions abroad, supported reformist causes, and never abandoned the belief that literature could shape moral thought. This chapter of her life lacked spectacle, but it demonstrated something rarer than youthful rebellion: endurance. Mary Shelley proved that survival itself could be a radical act, and that creation did not end with tragedy, but could continue patiently against the odds. By the time Mary Shelley reached her final years, she had become a strange contradiction in the public imagination. Famous, yet misunderstood. Celebrated, yet quietly sidelined. To many readers, she remained the teenage girl who had written Frankenstein during a stormy summer. To others, she was still primarily the widow of a great poet. Rarely was she seen for what she truly was: a lifelong professional writer who endured loss, scandal, poverty, and illness without surrendering her independence or intellect. Mary spent her later years caring for her son, Percy Florence Shelley, whose future she guarded fiercely. Ensuring his stability meant navigating complex relationships with Percy Shelley's aristocratic family, managing limited finances, and maintaining her reputation in a society that never fully forgave her youthful defiance. Respectability, once denied to her, became a tool she used strategically rather than a value she worshipped. Her health steadily declined. Chronic pain, weakness, and neurological symptoms made daily life difficult, yet she continued reading, thinking, and writing for as long as she was able. She revised earlier works, reflected on her past, and watched as Frankenstein took on a life entirely its own. The novel was adapted for the stage, altered, sensationalized, and simplified. The creature became a monster in popular culture, even though Mary had written him as a thinking, feeling being shaped by neglect. In many ways, the fate of her novel mirrored her own: reduced, misunderstood, yet impossible to erase. Mary Shelley died in 1851, at the age of 53. She left behind no dramatic final gesture, no manifesto, no grand farewell. What she left instead was something far more durable, a body of work that continued to ask uncomfortable questions. What do creators owe their creations? What happens when society abandons responsibility in the name of progress? How much loneliness can a human endure before turning bitter or cruel? Over time, her reputation shifted. Scholars began to recognize her philosophical depth, her political awareness, and her influence on science fiction, Gothic literature, and feminist thought. She was no longer just the woman behind Frankenstein. She was a thinker shaped by grief, survival, and relentless observation. Mary Shelley outlived nearly everyone who once defined her. In doing so, she claimed something rare for a woman of her era: authorship of her own life. And that, perhaps, was her greatest creation. Long before glass pyramids and hushed galleries, the Louvre began its life as something far more practical and far more brutal. In the late 12th century, Paris was not yet the elegant capital of culture it would become. It was a growing medieval city vulnerable to invasion, especially from the northwest. To protect it, King Philip Augustus ordered the construction of a massive stone fortress on the city's edge, right where the Louvre now stands. This original Louvre was not built to inspire. It was built to intimidate. Thick limestone walls rose from the ground, reinforced by towers and surrounded by a defensive moat fed by the Seine. At its heart stood a huge central keep. cold, windowless, and imposing. Soldiers patrolled its ramparts, weapons ready, while below them the city lived under the constant reminder that royal power was never far away. The fortress served as both shield and warning. From here, the king could watch the river traffic and control access to Paris. It was a statement of authority carved into stone. Inside, conditions were harsh. This was no palace of comfort. The rooms were dark, damp, and designed for defence, not beauty. The Louvre's earliest corridors echoed not with footsteps of tourists, but with armour, boots, and the tension of siege preparedness. Yet even in this early phase, the Louvre began accumulating layers, both physical and symbolic. Prisoners were held within its walls. Treasures and royal records were stored here, guarded like military assets. The building became a vault of power, secrecy, and fear. What lay behind its walls was not meant to be seen by the public. As Paris expanded, the city slowly grew around the fortress. Streets crept closer. Markets flourished nearby. What was once a frontier defence became swallowed by urban life. The Louvre no longer stood at the edge of civilization. It stood at its centre. And with that shift came a crucial transformation. By the time later kings looked at the grim old fortress, they saw not just stone and battlements, but potential. The walls that once kept enemies out could now keep courtiers in. The stronghold of war would slowly become a residence of power. But deep beneath the modern museum, traces of this first Louvre still remain. Medieval foundations, hidden passages, and the ghostly outline of the old keep lie buried below polished floors, silent proof that the world's most famous art museum was born not from beauty, but from fear. As the medieval city tightened its grip around the old stronghold, the Louvre began to feel out of place. By the 14th century, Paris was no longer a frontier town. It was a political and cultural centre, and its kings no longer wanted to live in cold stone fortresses designed for war. They wanted comfort, ceremony, and visibility. The transformation began under King Charles V, who looked at the grim medieval Louvre and decided it was time for reinvention. Charles V did not tear the fortress down. Instead, he softened it. Towers were reshaped, windows were enlarged to let in light rather than arrows. Interiors were remodelled to include private chambers, libraries, and spaces for courtly life. For the first time, the Louvre became a place where a king actually lived, not just ruled from a distance. The former military outpost slowly evolved into a royal residence. This shift changed the building's atmosphere entirely. Where soldiers once stood watch, courtiers now whispered. Where weapons had been stored, tapestries were hung. The Louvre became a stage for power rather than a shield against it. The king's presence turned the structure into a symbol of stability, culture, and authority, at least on the surface. But the past was never fully erased. Beneath the new decorations, the old fortress remained. Secret stairways, thick walls, and narrow passages continued to shape daily life. The palace was still a place of control. Access to the king was carefully regulated, and the architecture reinforced hierarchy. Who stood where, who entered which room, and who waited in the shadows, all of it mattered. The Louvre also became a repository of royal wealth. Manuscripts, jewels, ceremonial objects, and archives were stored within its walls. Power was no longer just military. It was cultural, symbolic, and bureaucratic. The building reflected that change perfectly. As generations passed, each ruler altered the Louvre to suit personal tastes and political needs. Some expanded it, others neglected it. But none could fully escape its layered history. The building had become a living archive of monarchy itself, part fortress, part palace, part labyrinth. By the end of the medieval period, the Louvre stood at a crossroads. It was no longer a place of war, but it was not yet a temple of art. It was something in between, a royal machine, humming quietly with intrigue, ambition, and the constant performance of power. The next great transformation of the Louvre came not from caution, but from ambition. When King Francis I returned from his Italian campaigns in the early 16th century, he came back changed. He had seen Renaissance courts filled with art, symmetry, and humanist ideals, and the medieval heaviness of the Louvre suddenly felt embarrassing. Stone walls and narrow towers belonged to an older world. Francis wanted splendour. Rather than patching the old palace, he began dismantling it. The great medieval keep, the very heart of the original fortress, was demolished. In its place rose elegant facades inspired by Italian Renaissance design. Columns replaced battlements. Proportion replaced brute strength. The message was clear. Royal power no longer needed to hide behind walls. It could announce itself through beauty. This was not merely an architectural update. It was a political statement. Francis I wanted France to rival Italy as the cultural leader of Europe, and the Louvre would be his proof. He invited artists, architects and thinkers to his court, including the aging Leonardo da Vinci, whose works would later form the core of the royal collection. Art became an extension of monarchy, a way to project intellect and legitimacy. Inside the palace, space was reorganized around ceremony. Grand staircases controlled movement. Long galleries allowed processions of courtiers to be seen and judged. Nothing was accidental. Architecture became choreography, guiding bodies and eyes toward the king. To be visible at the Louvre was to exist. To be excluded was political death. Yet even as the Renaissance palace rose, the building's old secrets remained buried below. Medieval foundations still supported the new elegance. Hidden rooms and forgotten passages lingered beneath marble and plaster, reminders that the past was never fully destroyed, only covered. The Louvre became a place of contradictions. It celebrated human creativity while reinforcing absolute power. It displayed beauty while quietly enforcing hierarchy. Art softened authority, but it also magnified it. This period set the tone for everything that followed. The Louvre was no longer just where kings lived. It was where kings performed. And in turning stone into spectacle, Francis I permanently altered the purpose of the building, transforming it into a monument not only to power, but to image, legacy, and control. By the late Renaissance, the Louvre had become less a home and more a pressure chamber. It was magnificent on the surface, filled with art, ceremony, and ritual, but beneath the elegance pulsed constant tension. To live at the Louvre was to exist inside a web of surveillance, rivalry, and whispered ambition. Court life was theatrical, but it was also dangerous. Kings, queens, and nobles moved through carefully choreographed spaces where every gesture carried meaning. A misplaced word could end a career. A glance could spark a feud. Favour was currency, and access to royal chambers determined survival. The architecture reinforced this reality. Corridors narrowed deliberately. Rooms were layered with thresholds. Power was measured in proximity. It was during this era that figures like Catherine de' Medici wielded immense influence from within the palace. As queen, widow, and regent, she understood the Louvre not just as a residence, but as a tool. She hosted lavish entertainments while quietly arranging marriages, alliances, and eliminations. The palace became a chessboard, and the players rarely saw the whole game. Violence was never far away. Religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants seeped into court life, poisoning trust. In 1772, the nearby events of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre stained Paris with blood. Though much of the violence unfolded in the streets, the Louvre was not untouched. Protestant nobles who had come for a royal wedding suddenly found themselves trapped within the palace. Some murdered in spaces meant for diplomacy and celebration. The walls that once defended against foreign armies now enclosed terror. Hallways echoed with running footsteps. Doors were barred. What had been a symbol of order became a cage. The palace's beauty did nothing to soften the brutality of power when it turned inward. Despite the danger, life at the Louvre continued. Banquets were held. Art was commissioned. Ritual persisted as if violence were merely another inconvenience. This was the true nature of royal power, its ability to absorb bloodshed without breaking stride. The Louvre's polished halls concealed fear, and its grandeur masked fragility. Kings ruled not from certainty, but from constant anxiety. Every smile hid calculation. Every celebration risked catastrophe. By the end of this period, the Louvre had become a monument to contradiction, a palace of beauty built atop paranoia. Its walls remembered everything, even when official history tried to forget. For all its splendor and history, the Louvre was ultimately rejected by the very monarchy that had shaped it. That turning point came under King Louis XIV, a ruler whose obsession with control would redefine royal power and quietly hollow out the Louvre. Louis XIV inherited a kingdom scarred by rebellion. As a child, he had lived through the chaos of the Fronde, a series of uprisings that had forced the royal family to flee Paris. The memory never left him. To Louis, the city represented danger, unpredictability, and the constant threat of defiance. The Louvre, sitting at the heart of Paris, was no longer a symbol of authority. It was a liability. His solution was radical. Rather than rule from within the city, Louis withdrew from it entirely. He transformed a modest hunting lodge outside Paris into the vast palace of Versailles, a place designed to isolate the king from the population and trap the nobility within an endless performance of loyalty. Power would no longer be negotiated in narrow corridors. It would radiate outward from a single, untouchable centre. When the court moved to Versailles, the Louvre was left behind, physically intact but politically obsolete. Its grand halls fell silent. Courtiers vanished. The rituals that once animated its rooms migrated west, leaving the palace in an uncomfortable limbo. It was no longer a royal residence, yet it was far too symbolic to abandon entirely. Instead, the Louvre was repurposed. Artists, academies, and royal workshops were installed within its walls. Painters, sculptors, and architects moved into spaces once reserved for nobles. For the first time, creation replaced ceremony as the building's primary activity. This shift was subtle, but profound. The Palace of Kings began its long transition into a house of culture. Yet the change was not driven by generosity. Louis XIV did not open the Louvre to elevate artists. He simply no longer needed the space. Art, like everything else, remained under royal control. Studios existed by permission, not right. The building became quieter, but it was still watched. This abandonment marked the beginning of the end for the Louvre as a symbol of absolute monarchy. Stripped of its political heartbeat, it became something unstable, part relic, part experiment. The kings had moved on. The building, for the first time, had been left to wait. By the late 18th century, the Louvre stood in an uneasy silence. It was no longer a royal home, yet it remained a powerful symbol of monarchy. Vast, expensive, and looming over a city simmering with anger. While artists worked in its galleries and administrators debated its purpose, the political ground beneath Paris was beginning to crack. When the French Revolution erupted, the Louvre's meaning changed overnight. The palace that had once embodied royal authority was suddenly rebranded as property of the people. Kings no longer ruled from behind its walls, but their ghosts still lingered in every corridor. The revolutionaries understood symbolism well. If the old order was to be destroyed, its monuments had to be reclaimed. As crowds filled the streets and the monarchy collapsed, royal collections were seized. Paintings, sculptures, scientific instruments, and decorative objects, once locked away for elite eyes, were declared national property. The Louvre was no longer a palace waiting for kings who would never return. It was about to become something unprecedented. In 1793, during the most radical phase of the Revolution, the Louvre officially opened as a public museum. This was not an act of cultural generosity. It was ideological warfare. Art was transformed into proof that the nation, not the monarchy, was now the rightful heir to France's heritage. Walking through the galleries became a political act, yet the transition was chaotic. The same halls that now displayed masterpieces had recently echoed with fear. Outside, executions continued. Inside, curators rushed to catalogue and protect objects from looting, vandalism, and neglect. The building was caught between enlightenment and terror. The irony was sharp. A palace built to control access was now open to all, at least in theory. Ordinary citizens wandered through spaces once guarded by protocol and power, staring at treasures they had never been meant to see. The Louvre had become a stage for a new experiment, whether culture could belong to everyone. Not everything survived intact. Some artworks were destroyed, others sold, others stolen in the chaos. Revolutionary zeal did not always distinguish between oppression and history. Still, the idea endured. The Louvre was reborn not as a symbol of kings, but as a monument to the nation. This chapter marked the most radical transformation in the building's long life. The fortress had become a palace. The palace had become a museum. And beneath the marble floors, centuries of power quietly shifted hands, this time without asking permission. The revolution had turned the Louvre into a museum of the people, but it was empire that turned it into a museum of power. When Napoleon Bonaparte rose from general to ruler, he understood immediately what the Louvre could become. Art was no longer just heritage, it was propaganda. Napoleon renamed the Louvre the Musée Napoléon, a symbolic gesture that made his ambitions unmistakable. As his armies marched across Europe, they did not return empty-handed. Masterpieces were seized from Italy, the Low Countries, Germany and beyond. Paintings, statues, manuscripts and relics were stripped from churches and palaces, packed into crates and shipped to Paris. Victory was measured not only in territory, but in treasures. Inside the Louvre, galleries were rearranged to tell a very specific story. Art was displayed as proof of French superiority, ordered to suggest that history itself had culminated in Napoleon's reign. Ancient Rome, Renaissance Italy, and classical Greece were reframed as stepping stones, leading inevitably to imperial France. To walk the museum was to walk through an argument. This was not subtle theft. It was systematic, public, and unapologetic. Napoleon believed Paris deserved to be the capital of world culture, and the Louvre would be its altar. Artists and scholars were divided, some thrilled by access to unprecedented collections, others disturbed by the violence that made it possible. For visitors, the experience was overwhelming. Never before had so much of Europe's cultural heritage been concentrated in one place. The Louvre became a destination not just for citizens, but for foreign dignitaries forced to admire what had been taken from them. But empires rarely last. When Napoleon fell, the question of ownership returned with force. Defeated nations demanded their art back. Crates were reopened. Catalogues were scrutinised. Many works were repatriated, though not all. Some objects quietly remained, absorbed into the permanent collection. This period left a permanent scar on the Louvre's identity. It exposed the uncomfortable truth that museums are not neutral spaces. They reflect power, conquest, and choice. What is displayed is often what survived domination. The Musée Napoléon vanished with the empire, but its legacy endured. The Louvre emerged larger, richer, and more controversial than ever. A palace of art built partly on plunder, its grandeur inseparable from the violence that helped create it. By the 19th century, the Louvre had settled into its new identity as a museum, but its past was far from buried. Beneath the polished floors and carefully lit galleries lay a hidden world most visitors would never see. The Louvre was not just layered in history metaphorically, it was layered physically, stacked century upon century, with forgotten spaces sealed off below. As renovations expanded the museum, workers repeatedly stumbled upon remnants of earlier lives. Medieval walls emerged from beneath marble. Old moats were uncovered, still damp centuries after they were filled in. Foundations from the original fortress reappeared like bones pushed to the surface. Instead of destroying them, curators made an unusual decision. The past would remain visible, but controlled. These underground spaces became silent witnesses to everything the Louvre had been. Visitors today can walk through sections of the medieval fortress beneath the museum, tracing the outlines of towers built for war, not art. The contrast is unsettling. Above, the world's most famous paintings hang in climate-controlled calm. Below, rough stone walls whisper of fear, defense, and confinement. But not all secrets were architectural. The Louvre developed its own hidden infrastructure, tunnels, service corridors, and restricted passages designed to move art unseen. Masterpieces are rarely transported through public halls. Instead, they travel through underground routes known only to staff, shielded from crowds and cameras. The museum has its own shadow circulation system, invisible but essential. During times of crisis, these hidden spaces became lifelines. In wartime, artworks were quietly evacuated through back corridors and tunnels, packed and sent away under secrecy. During occupations and unrest, the Louvre learned how to disappear its treasures without appearing empty. What visitors see has always been carefully curated, not just aesthetically, but strategically. There are also stories that never made it into official records, objects mislabeled, works quietly removed, discoveries left unpublished because they complicated neat narratives. Museums present order, but they are built on decisions: what to show, what to hide, and what to forget. The Louvre's hidden past is not just about secret rooms. It is about control of memory. Every museum is an argument about history, and the Louvre's argument is reinforced by what lies beneath it. Above ground, the building celebrates civilization. Below, it preserves its anxieties. Fortress, palace, museum, none fully replaced the others. They coexist, stacked one on top of the next, reminding anyone who looks closely that the Louvre is not just a container of history, it is history itself, still holding its breath underground. Today, the Louvre presents itself as timeless, calm, authoritative, and universal. Millions pass through its doors each year, guided by maps and audio tours that promise clarity and order. Yet this sense of permanence is carefully constructed. The modern Louvre is the result of constant reinvention, each era reshaping the building to suit its own idea of power, culture, and legitimacy. The most visible symbol of this reinvention arrived in the late 20th century with the glass pyramid. Designed to modernize access and circulation, it was controversial from the moment it appeared. Critics saw it as an intrusion. Supporters praised its symbolism. But beneath the debate was a familiar pattern: the Louvre once again adapting to remain central, relevant, and controlled. The pyramid did not replace the past. It reorganized how the public encounters it. What visitors see today is the end result of centuries of selection. Not just selection of art, but selection of narrative. Some objects are elevated to global icons. Others remain in storage, unseen. Entire histories are condensed into captions, while uncomfortable origins, looting, coercion, erasure, are often softened or omitted. This is not deception so much as design. Museums do not show everything. They never have. The Louvre's authority comes from its ability to frame history as settled. Walls are quiet. Labels are confident. The chaos that once defined the building, sieges, massacres, revolutions, is smoothed into chronology. Yet those events still shape what hangs on the walls and what does not. Security is omnipresent. Cameras watch every movement. Guards patrol with practiced calm. Climate systems hum constantly to preserve fragile objects. The fortress logic never vanished. It simply changed form. Where once walls protected kings, systems now protect artifacts. The purpose remains the same: preservation of power through control of space. And yet the Louvre also represents something genuine. It is a place where humanity confronts its own record, beauty alongside violence, genius alongside exploitation. Few buildings contain so much contradiction so openly. The Louvre did not become a museum by accident. It was shaped by rulers, rebels, empires, and curators, each leaving a layer behind. Fortress, palace, prison, workshop, museum. None erased the others. To walk its halls is to move through centuries of decisions about who owns culture, who defines history, and who gets to look. The Louvre's hidden past is not hidden at all. It is embedded, quietly, permanently, in every stone beneath your feet. Long before glass became something shaped by human hands, it already existed in nature, formed by forces far older and more violent than civilization. When lightning struck sandy ground, the heat fused grains into twisting glassy tubes known today as fulgurites. When volcanoes erupted, molten lava cooled into obsidian, a sharp black glass prized by prehistoric peoples for blades and tools. Humans admired these materials, but for thousands of years, glass remained something encountered, not created. The leap from accident to invention required a specific moment, sustained fire hot enough to melt sand, and someone curious enough to notice what happened afterward. Ancient camps along rivers and coasts unknowingly set the stage. Sand was everywhere. Fire was central to daily life. What was missing was control. According to a famous story recorded by Pliny the Elder, the invention of glass occurred by chance when merchants cooking on a beach used blocks of natron to support their pots. The fire grew intense, the sand fused, and a strange, translucent substance flowed out. While this tale is likely simplified, it captures an essential truth. Glass-making began not as art, but as surprise. The earliest evidence of human-made glass points to the ancient Near East, particularly regions of Mesopotamia and Egypt. At first, glass was rare, unpredictable, and difficult to reproduce. Early attempts produced opaque, brittle materials, more suitable for beads and small ornaments than practical use. These early glassmakers were not craftsmen in the modern sense. They were experimenters working at the edge of their knowledge, pushing fire beyond its familiar boundaries. Glass demanded precision before precision existed. Temperatures had to be high and sustained. Ingredients had to be measured without scales. Cooling had to be slow to prevent cracking. Each failed attempt taught another lesson. Each success felt almost magical, a solid that flowed like liquid, a stone that captured light. What made glass extraordinary was not just how it was made, but how it behaved. Unlike metal, it did not bend. Unlike stone, it could be translucent. It occupied a strange middle ground between solid and liquid, predictable only once its secrets were learned. This ambiguity fascinated early societies. From the beginning, glass was associated with fire, transformation, and mystery. It did not simply come from nature. It emerged through human intervention. In mastering glass, humanity discovered that even the most ordinary materials could be remade into something astonishing if heat, patience, and imagination were applied in just the right measure. Once humans learned to coax glass into existence, it did not become an everyday material. It became a luxury. In the ancient world, glass was difficult to make, unpredictable, and expensive, qualities that made it perfect for elites and sacred spaces. In early Egypt and the Near East, glass was not valued for transparency, but for colour. Deep blues, greens, and opaque whites mimicked precious stones like lapis lazuli and turquoise, materials associated with divinity and power. In ancient Egypt, glass production flourished under royal control. Workshops were often attached directly to temples or palaces, and recipes were guarded closely. Glassmakers were specialists, sometimes working alongside metalworkers and jewelers. Their output was small but symbolic: beads, amulets, inlays, and cosmetic containers. These objects were not meant for daily use. They were offerings to gods, markers of rank, and companions for the dead. Glass quickly became intertwined with religion. Egyptians believed colour carried meaning and power. Blue represented the heavens and the Nile. Green symbolized rebirth and regeneration. Glass, with its ability to hold colour permanently, was seen as a way to freeze sacred qualities into physical form. Amulets made of glass were placed on mummies, believed to protect the soul in the afterlife. In Mesopotamia, glass served similar roles. Kings used it to display wealth and connection to the divine order. Glass objects appeared in temples and royal treasuries, often alongside gold and ivory. Written tablets from the period describe glass-making recipes in cryptic language, reinforcing the idea that this knowledge bordered on alchemy. Glass was not just manufactured, it was conjured. What mattered most was rarity. Because glass was so difficult to produce consistently, owning it signalled control over both labour and knowledge. A glass vessel was proof that someone commanded fire itself. This is why early glass never replaced pottery or metal. It existed above them, not alongside them. These early societies did not yet imagine glass as something to look through. They saw it as something to look at. Its smooth surface, unnatural colours, and reflective sheen made it feel otherworldly. Light did not simply bounce off glass, it seemed to live inside it. At this stage in its history, glass was not about function, it was about meaning. It connected rulers to gods, the living to the dead, and humanity to the transformative power of fire. Only later would glass descend from temples and tombs into the hands of ordinary people and change the world in far more practical ways. The true revolution in glass did not come from priests or kings, but from engineers. When the Roman world expanded across the Mediterranean, it carried with it a hunger for scale, efficiency, and practicality. Glass was no longer expected to be rare or mysterious. It was about to become useful. This shift transformed glass from a sacred novelty into a material that reshaped daily life. Roman glassmakers inherited techniques from earlier cultures, but they improved them relentlessly. The most important breakthrough came with the development of glassblowing in the 1st century before the Common Era. By inflating molten glass through a hollow tube, artisans could shape vessels quickly and consistently. Production time dropped dramatically, costs fell. Glass stopped being exclusive. For the first time, glass vessels became common in homes, taverns, and markets. Cups, bottles, and storage containers appeared across the empire, from Italy to the provinces. Glass was hygienic, non-porous, and odourless, qualities that made it superior to clay for certain uses. Wine tasted like wine. Oils stayed pure. Everyday life quietly improved, but Rome's most radical use of glass was architectural. Thin sheets of translucent glass were set into window frames, especially in bathhouses and wealthy homes. These early windows were not perfectly clear, but they allowed light in while keeping wind and rain out. It was a subtle change with enormous consequences. Interior spaces became brighter. Architecture could now shape light itself. Glass altered how Romans experienced the world. Public baths glowed with filtered sunlight. Villas felt open yet protected. Boundaries between inside and outside softened. For the first time, people could look out without being exposed. Glass also became a symbol of refinement. Clear glass signalled technological mastery. It showed that raw materials could be purified, controlled, and standardized. Even imperfections, the bubbles and ripples, became marks of authenticity rather than flaws. Roman trade networks spread glass everywhere. Workshops emerged across the empire, each adapting styles and techniques to local tastes. Glass was no longer tied to one culture or religion. It became a shared material language. This was the moment when glass stopped imitating gemstones and began defining itself. Transparency changed everything. Light became a design element. Visibility became desirable. In mastering clear glass, Rome changed not just what people used, but how they saw, and how they thought about space, cleanliness, and comfort. Glass had left the temple and entered the home. And in doing so, it quietly redefined civilization. When the Roman Empire fractured, many technologies vanished with it, but glass did not disappear. Instead, it migrated. As imperial infrastructure collapsed in Western Europe, the knowledge of glassmaking survived in places where stability, scholarship, and skilled labour endured. Glass retreated from mass production and returned, temporarily, to something closer to a specialist craft. In the Eastern Mediterranean, the Byzantine Empire became a crucial guardian of glass-making knowledge. Constantinople inherited Roman techniques and refined them, especially in the production of coloured and gilded glass. Glass tesserae, small cubes used in mosaics, covered church interiors, transforming walls into fields of shimmering light. Here, glass was not transparent. It was luminous. Gold leaf trapped between layers of glass made saints and emperors glow as if lit from within. At the same time, the Islamic world emerged as a centre of innovation rather than preservation. From Syria and Egypt to Persia, glassmakers experimented boldly with chemistry and form. Islamic artisans developed new colours, improved clarity, and advanced decorative techniques such as enamel painting and lustreware. Glass vessels were inscribed with calligraphy, turning functional objects into carriers of poetry, prayer, and status. Unlike medieval Europe, where glassmaking became fragmented and limited, Islamic cities supported large workshops and encouraged experimentation. Scholars wrote treatises on materials and processes, treating glass not as mystery, but as science. Recipes were refined, failures were documented, progress accelerated. One of the most important contributions of this period was chemical control. Islamic glassmakers perfected the use of plant ash and mineral additives to stabilize glass and improve transparency. This made larger, more reliable objects possible. Glass was no longer just decorative, it was technical. Trade spread these innovations. Glass from the eastern Mediterranean travelled along caravan routes and across seas, reaching Europe, Africa, and Asia. Each exchange carried techniques as well as objects. Slowly, knowledge flowed back westward. In Europe, monasteries and cathedral workshops became quiet centres of glass survival. While everyday glass remained rare, religious institutions preserved the craft through stained glass windows. These windows were not meant to be seen clearly through. They were meant to transform light into narrative and emotion. Glass became storytelling. This period kept the fire alive, literally and intellectually. Glassmaking did not advance rapidly everywhere, but it did not break. It adapted to new cultures, new beliefs, and new purposes. When glass would rise again as a transformative material, it would do so carrying the accumulated knowledge of empires, religions, and centuries of careful, patient fire. By the late medieval period, glass found a new home where trade, secrecy, and ambition intersected. Venice. Floating between East and West, Venice absorbed techniques from the Byzantine and Islamic worlds and refined them with ruthless focus. Glassmaking there was not just a craft, it was a state project. The Republic understood that control over knowledge could be as powerful as control over armies. To protect the city from fire and to guard trade secrets, Venetian authorities moved all glass workshops to the island of Murano. What followed was unprecedented specialization. Glassmakers became a privileged class, granted social status and legal protections, on one condition: they could never leave. The penalty for exporting secrets was severe. Venice built a gilded cage around genius. Within that cage, innovation exploded. Murano artisans perfected cristallo, an ultra-clear glass that rivaled rock crystal. For the first time since Rome, clarity became an obsession. Vessels grew thinner, lighter, and more precise. Stems twisted like vines. Bowls flared like petals. Glass was no longer merely functional or symbolic, it was virtuosity made visible. Colour returned, but with new control. Milky Latimo imitated porcelain. Aventurine sparkled with copper flecks. Filigree threads were embedded inside transparent walls, freezing motion within solid form. These were not accidents of fire. They were calculated effects, achieved through exact timing and composition. Glassmaking had become choreography. Venetian glass spread across Europe as a luxury export. Courts competed to display Murano pieces on banquet tables and in cabinets of curiosity. Possessing Venetian glass signalled taste, wealth, and connection to the most advanced craftsmanship of the age. Imitators tried and failed to replicate it. Without the recipes, the results fell short. This success bred paranoia. Glassmakers were watched, marriages were regulated, even travel required permission. Venice treated glass as intellectual property centuries before the term existed. The material that once symbolized mystery now symbolized monopoly. Yet the pressure had a cost. Innovation slowed as secrecy hardened into rigidity. Other regions began to experiment independently, breaking Venice's hold. Still, the Murano legacy endured. It proved that glass could be mastered to extremes, clear as air, thin as leaves, strong enough to endure centuries. In Venice, glass crossed a threshold. It became pure skill, human control over heat, chemistry and time, captured forever in a form that looked impossibly fragile and yet survived. As glass-making techniques improved, glass escaped the table and the workshop and began reshaping how humans perceived reality itself. The most transformative shift came when glass was no longer admired as an object, but trusted as a medium, something you could look through, rely on, and build knowledge around. Clear window glass spread slowly across Europe, first in churches and elite homes, then outward. Light, once a scarce and directional resource, could now be managed. Interiors brightened. Walls no longer had to be thick and defensive. Architecture opened itself to the outside world. Glass changed cities before anyone noticed it had done so. But the real revolution arrived when glass learned to bend light. Early lenses had existed in crude form for centuries, but improved clarity and consistency made them practical. Convex glass could magnify. Concave glass could correct vision. Eyeglasses appeared in late medieval Europe, quietly extending productive life for scholars, scribes, and craftsmen. Knowledge stopped being limited by aging eyes. Then curiosity took over. Glass lenses were stacked, shaped, and aligned. The result was the telescope and the microscope, devices that shattered old assumptions about scale and place. The heavens were no longer fixed lights embedded in crystal spheres. The natural world was no longer smooth and complete. Glass revealed motion, imperfection, and depth where none had been seen before. Through lenses, humans saw mountains on the moon, rings around distant planets, and microorganisms writhing in a drop of water. These discoveries were not philosophical arguments. They were visual facts, and they destabilized entire worldviews. Glass became dangerous. Religious and political authorities understood this immediately. A material that allowed people to see for themselves weakened inherited truth. Observation challenged doctrine. Measurement challenged tradition. The clarity of glass supported a new kind of thinking, empirical, skeptical, and restless. At the same time, glass entered printing and navigation. Glass plates improved presses. Lenses refined maps and instruments. Mariners trusted glass compasses and optical tools to cross oceans. Empires expanded on the back of transparent precision. What made glass so powerful was its neutrality. It did not argue. It showed. Once something was seen clearly, it could not be unseen. Glass turned vision into evidence. This chapter marked a turning point. Glass was no longer just crafted. It was integrated into thought itself. It became an extension of the human eye, correcting it, enhancing it, and ultimately challenging humanity's place in the universe. From this moment on, glass was inseparable from science, exploration, and doubt. The world was no longer interpreted solely through authority. It was examined, through fire-made sand that had learned how to tell the truth. For most of its history, glass remained tied to skilled hands and small workshops. Even at its most advanced, production was slow, fragile, and limited. That changed abruptly with the arrival of industrialization. Fire, once carefully tended by artisans, was now harnessed by machines. Glass was about to lose its intimacy and gain unprecedented reach. The key shift was scale. New furnaces burned hotter and longer than any human-operated hearth. Coal replaced wood. Temperatures became consistent. Recipes stabilized. What had once taken days of careful labour could now be produced continuously. Glass sheets grew larger. Bottles became standardised. Imperfections that once marked individuality were now considered flaws to be eliminated. Factories transformed glass into infrastructure. Windows were no longer luxuries reserved for churches and palaces. They appeared in townhouses, schools, shops, and eventually factories themselves. Buildings filled with light. Urban life changed rhythm. Interiors no longer depended on open doors or daylight hours. Work extended. Surveillance increased. Visibility became normal. Glass also reshaped industry directly. Bottles preserved food and medicine safely and cheaply. Chemical experiments relied on glass containers that resisted corrosion and revealed reactions clearly. Laboratories multiplied. Science accelerated. Glass became the silent partner of progress. The most dramatic innovation came with new methods for producing flat glass. Techniques evolved until large, relatively even panes could be manufactured reliably. Storefronts appeared, transforming commerce. Goods could now be displayed behind transparent barriers, seen but protected. Desire was encouraged. Consumption became visual. This period also marked a shift in labour. Glassworkers lost autonomy. Skills passed down through generations were replaced by mechanised processes and factory discipline. The material survived, but the culture around it changed. Glass was no longer mysterious or rare. It was expected. And yet, something deeper happened. As glass became ubiquitous, people stopped noticing it. Transparency turned invisible. Windows disappeared from awareness even as they dominated space. Glass shaped experience quietly, separating inside from outside, public from private, observer from observed. By the end of this chapter, glass had fully entered modern life. It was no longer admired as an object. It was trusted as an environment. Walls became transparent. Containers became neutral. Vision became continuous. Glass had completed its transformation from sacred substance to everyday necessity, and in doing so, it prepared the world for its final role, not just showing reality, but mediating it entirely. By the 20th century, glass no longer announced itself. It surrounded quietly, shaping modern life so completely that it became almost invisible. Skyscrapers rose wrapped in reflective skins. Cities turned into vertical mirrors. Where stone once projected permanence and power, glass now projected openness, efficiency, and control. Architects embraced glass as ideology. Transparency suggested honesty. Light implied progress. Buildings made of glass claimed nothing to hide, even as they reflected everything back at the viewer. Offices filled with daylight, but also with observation. Glass created openness while enabling surveillance. You could see, but you were also seen. Advances in chemistry and engineering pushed glass further. Safety glass shattered without killing. Tempered glass grew stronger than intuition allowed. Laminated glass resisted impact and intrusion. The material that once terrified glassmakers with its fragility became structurally reliable. Walls no longer had to feel solid to be strong. At the same time, glass shrank. Fibre optics transformed glass into threads thinner than hair, carrying light instead of images. Information raced through transparent veins beneath oceans and cities. Conversations, data, and economies flowed through glass without being noticed. Sand, melted and stretched, became the nervous system of the global world. Glass also entered medicine. It allowed surgeons to see inside bodies, chemists to isolate compounds, and researchers to observe life at microscopic scales. Sterile, inert, and transparent, it became a tool of trust. When something mattered, it was put in glass. Yet the emotional relationship with glass changed. It no longer felt magical. It felt neutral. Screens replaced windows. Glass stopped framing the outside world and began displaying curated realities instead. Phones, tablets, and monitors turned glass into an interface between humans and abstraction. We no longer looked through glass to see reality. we looked at glass to access it. This shift carried consequences. Glass mediated experience. It filtered information. It separated touch from sight. The material that once expanded vision now shaped attention. Still, its power remained rooted in the same ancient qualities: transparency, transformation, and control of light. From cathedral windows to phone screens, glass continued doing what it always had, deciding what could be seen and how. By this stage, glass had become the most trusted material in the world. We relied on it to protect us, inform us, and connect us. We trusted it precisely because we stopped noticing it. And that was its final transformation, not into art, not into science, but into environment. Glass was no longer an object in the world. It was the surface through which the world itself was experienced. Glass began as molten accident and ended as worldview. By the time it fully embedded itself into modern life, it had done more than reshape architecture or technology. It had quietly altered how humans understand reality itself. Few materials have influenced thought so deeply while remaining so physically silent. Glass taught humanity to value clarity. Not just optical clarity, but conceptual clarity. The idea that truth could be seen, measured, and verified depended on transparent tools. Science relied on glass to reveal reactions, cells, and stars. Once the eye could be extended and corrected, belief shifted, authority weakened, observation gained power, seeing became knowing. Glass also changed humanity's relationship with distance. Windows allowed separation without isolation. Lenses collapsed vast scales, bringing galaxies close and microbes into focus. Later, fiber optics erased distance altogether, turning light into information. Glass made the world feel smaller, faster, and more interconnected than any generation before could have imagined. At the same time, glass introduced new contradictions. Transparency promised honesty, but it also enabled surveillance. Walls that could be seen through could also be watched through. Display windows invited desire. Screens curated attention. Glass never forced these outcomes. It simply made them possible. Humans decided how to use what glass allowed. There is something uniquely unsettling about glass. It feels solid, but can vanish when struck. It protects while remaining fragile. It separates without fully dividing. These contradictions mirror human ambition itself, the desire to control nature while remaining vulnerable to it. Glass became the perfect partner to that impulse. Even today, glass sits at the boundary between presence and absence. A screen shows a face that is not there. A window frames a world you cannot touch. A lens reveals truths that challenge comfort. Glass mediates experience without replacing it, always reminding us that perception is shaped, not neutral. What makes glass extraordinary is not its chemistry, but its endurance. Civilizations collapsed. Empires fell. Belief systems changed. Glass adapted to all of them. It served gods, kings, scientists, merchants, and machines without belonging fully to any. From molten sand to stained windows, from obsidian blades to digital screens, glass followed humanity's desire to see more clearly, and sometimes to hide behind that clarity. It remains a material born of fire and patience, demanding control, yet punishing carelessness. In the end, glass did not just change how humans see the world. It changed what they expect to see, and what they believe counts as truth when they do.